The desert heat lay over the flight line in a wavering sheet that made the air itself seem unstable. Rows of Blackhawks stretched across the concrete, their rotors still, their dark frames shimmering against the horizon. The smell of dust and jet fuel mixed into something bitter, a taste that lingered in the mouth long after you tried to forget it. Mechanics moved between aircraft in slow rhythm, sweat running down their faces as they carried toolkits or wiped grime from their hands. It was the quiet pulse of maintenance, the work that kept everything ready for the moment chaos demanded flight again. Near the far end of the line, a woman crouched beside one of the helicopters. She worked with a precision that seemed almost rehearsed. She checked the fuel coupling twice, then locked it in with careful strength. Her movements deliberate and without flourish. Her uniform was clean but stripped bare. No name tag, no unit patch, no rank. In a place where insignia carried weight and identity, she appeared as an outline without color. Just another refueling technician, indistinguishable to those who passed by. Commander Richard Hale walked the tarmac, boots clicking against the concrete. He spoke with another officer, his expression focused, yet relaxed in the way of a man who carried long years of duty in silence. He had walked this line 100 times before. Yet today, he stopped. His eyes narrowed, his stride halting, his words fading. Something in the air held him still. The woman bent to shut off the pump, her hand brushing the switch with quiet familiarity. And as she did, she muttered a few words under her breath. Hale could not make out the exact phrasing, but the tone, the cadence, the steady undercurrent in her voice pierced through him like a blade. His chest tightened. His memory pulled him back without mercy to a night of confusion and fire, to the valley where men had nearly died until a single voice cut through the storm of overlapping calls. She coiled the fuel hose slowly, each loop placed with practiced calm. The sunlight caught her cheek for a moment, tracing a faint scar that ran along the line of her jaw. Hale's breath stilled in his throat. That scar, that voice, both belonged to someone he had sworn was gone. He had stood at her memorial, listened as her name was read aloud, watched the flag folded and placed in another's hands. Yet here she was, alive, faceless among the living, hidden in plain sight. His boots crunched over gravel as he stepped closer, unable to stop himself. She noticed him only when his shadow reached her boots. Her eyes lifted, pale, gray, and unnerving, meeting his with an ease that felt practiced. For half a heartbeat she froze, as though acknowledging the recognition between them, then returned to winding the last loop of hose without expression. Hale forced his voice through a throat that felt suddenly dry. He managed only one word, "Ma'am." Her head tilted slightly. A faint smile touched her mouth, more a trace of knowledge than warmth. She straightened, the fuel hose still in her hands, and her voice came low and unhurried, as if nothing in the world pressed upon her. "You can call me the refueler." Then she stepped past him, her boots sharp on the gravel, and disappeared into the shadow of the hangar. The officer beside Hale gave him a puzzled glance, but Hale remained frozen, eyes fixed on the place she had vanished. His pulse thundered as the taste of dust and fuel returned to his tongue. He thought he had seen a ghost, and in some way, he knew he had. The following morning, Richard Hale entered his office with the sense of a man already carrying too many questions. He pulled open the personnel database, typing her name with hands that felt stiff and uncertain. The result struck him like a hammer. Alexandra Ward. Status: killed in action. Date listed. Location: Narok Valley. A neat red stamp across the digital file, final and unyielding. He had attended the memorial. He had heard her name spoken in the cadence of loss. He remembered the folded flag, the way the chaplain's voice cracked as if even he could not believe she was gone. Yet Hale had stood only yesterday a few feet from her, the scar on her face shining in the light, her voice unmistakable. He shut the screen with more force than necessary and pressed his hands against his desk. The official record was clear, but so was his memory. Both could not be true. And the dissonance gnawed at him. Later, on the tarmac, he lingered near the line of helicopters. The mechanics worked in their familiar rhythm, joking, calling for tools, wiping grease from their forearms. She was there, a ghost moving between machines. Alexandra checked gauges, tapped the dials twice, listened to the steady hiss of fuel, and adjusted the coupling. She hummed softly as she worked, not enough for anyone else to notice. But Hale heard it, a low tune without words, one that pressed against his memory until it found its place. He had heard her hum it once before, faintly through the headset. The night Naruk Valley collapsed. The flashback came without permission. Static filled his ears. Voices piled over each other. Shouts for cover and for help. Then, her voice cut through, steady, level, commanding men to shift left, to stay low, to wait for the second burst before moving. She was the one voice that made order out of chaos. He remembered the sound of gunfire snapping over rocks, tracer rounds stitching across the valley floor. He remembered her breaking cover, running toward the pinned team with a wounded soldier clinging to her shoulder. He remembered watching through a helmet camera, grainy and unstable, her silhouette framed against fire before the feed went black. Afterward, there had been nothing but blood, ash, and the weight of calling her gone. Now, years later, that same woman stood in front of him, silent in the daylight, wiping her hands on a rag as if her existence had never been erased. None of the crew chiefs paid her any mind. Pilots passed within feet of her, never sparing a glance. She existed like part of the machinery, invisible, overlooked, a figure blurred into background. Hale realized with growing unease that invisibility was her shield. One she had worn so well that no one around her could even see her shape. The unmarked sleeves of her uniform seemed louder to him than any insignia could have been. The absence shouted its own message. Her identity had been erased, not by accident, but by design. She carried it with a quiet endurance, continuing her work with perfect precision as if nothing outside the task mattered. Hale's throat tightened as he watched. She was not dead, but neither was she alive in the way that mattered. The record said she was gone. And so the world behaved as though she was. The burden of survival hung on her shoulders heavier than death itself. She lived among them unseen, erased but breathing, her voice still humming through the dust and the drone of engines. Richard Hale rose before dawn the next day, restless, from a night with no sleep. The image of her face, the line of that scar, and the sound of her voice kept circling in his mind until he could no longer sit still. By the time the sun crept over the ridge, he was already moving across the base toward the hangars. The air was cool but heavy, the kind that promised heat would return soon enough. He found her exactly where he expected, crouched beside a Black Hawk, a wrench in her hand, the same rhythm of quiet, steady motion. She looked like she had never left this place, as if the last 8 years were nothing more than a dream. He stopped only a few feet from her. She did not look up, did not flinch, only tightened a bolt and checked the gauge as though she were alone. Hale's voice came low but charged with all the weight he had carried. He told her, "You died. I saw your name carved in stone." At last she looked up, the wrench still resting in her hand. Her pale eyes met his, clear and unwavering, and the faintest hint of a smile tugged at her mouth. "Supposed to be," she said quietly, "doesn't always mean much out here." The word struck him harder than he expected. He thought of the memorial stone, the black letters etched into permanence, the ceremony that had sealed her absence. He remembered the silence afterward, the way he had carried the guilt of not saving her. Now here she stood, calm as the morning, with that scar glowing faintly in the shaft of sunlight breaking through the hangar doors. Hale's voice shook with frustration. He demanded to know why she had disappeared, why she had allowed them to bury an empty box and close her file. She wiped her hands on a rag with unhurried calm. then set the wrench aside. She said only that missions do not always end when the orders do, and sometimes the fight continues where no record is kept. Her tone was even, without pride or sorrow. But every word carried the weight of experience. He studied Hare, realizing that her absence was no accident. The erasure had been deliberate. Somewhere, someone had decided she should be gone on paper, even while she kept moving in shadows. The thought made his skin prickle. She had lived in silence, carrying a burden none of them had understood. For a moment neither spoke. The hum of generators filled the space, and dust drifted through the sunbeam that framed her scar. Hale felt a knot in his chest as he finally accepted that she was real. Not a ghost. Not a trick of memory. The past had broken into the present with undeniable force. He said more softly, "You could have come back." Her eyes did not waver. "I couldn't," she replied, not without undoing what had to be done. The simplicity of her words left him without answer. He looked down at the wrench in her hand, the most ordinary of tools, and thought of how easily she blended with the mechanics. She had become both invisible and unforgettable, erased on paper, yet alive in front of him. Some truths, he realized, cannot be buried. They survive in scars, in voices, in the unshakable certainty of recognition. 8 years earlier, the valley had been a bowl of fire. Richard Hale could still hear the static filling his headset, the clipped voices overlapping until they were nothing but noise. Men shouted coordinates, begged for cover, cursed when rounds slammed into the dirt around them. The pinned-down team was scattered across rocks and dry scrub, with enemy fire raking the ridgeline above. Chaos pressed in on every side. Then, through it all, one voice cut clean. Alexandra Ward spoke with the kind of steadiness that felt carved into stone. She called out enemy movements before they came into sight, told the men to hold position, to shift 5 meters left, to wait until the second burst of fire before moving. Her words pulled order from the storm. Hale remembered gripping his rifle tighter each time her voice came across. The only anchor against panic. The firefight swelled without pause. Tracer rounds stitched red arcs across the valley floor, slamming into dirt and stone. Grenades cracked against the hillside. Smoke clawed at their eyes. Over comms, someone shouted they were out of time. The team was being flanked. Hale's pulse hammered until Alexandra's voice cut in again, unhurried, as if she could see the whole battlefield while the rest of them were blind. She told them when to move, when to stay, when to breathe. For a moment, it felt like survival was possible. Then the sound shifted. Someone was hit. The cry was sharp, guttural, and unending. Hale turned to see one of the soldiers sprawled in the dirt, blood spilling fast. Before he could even reach him, Alexandra broke cover. She emerged from the rocks like she had never feared the fire. One arm pulled the wounded man upright, hauling his weight onto her shoulder. The other kept her rifle steady, firing bursts without hesitation as she dragged him toward a hollow in the ridge. Hale remembered it through the grain of a helmet camera feed, later played again and again as if the truth might change on repeat. Her silhouette flared against tracer fire, half obscured by smoke. Her stride never faltered, even as rounds chewed the earth around her. Then, mid-step, the feed cut to static. No image, no sound, but the empty hiss. Hale had stared at that frozen last frame longer than he ever admitted. The search had lasted hours. At dawn, they found only wreckage. The hillside hide where she had been was burned to blackened stone. Spent casings littered the ground. Blood smeared the dirt in dark lines that told a story without resolution. There was no body, no gear, no rifle. It was as if she had been consumed by the fire itself. Command called it status killed in action. They wrote her name into the list. Weeks later, the memorial was held. Hale stood in formation, the words of the chaplain muffled against the weight in his chest. He remembered the folded flag placed in the arms of a man called her brother, the solemn nod, the finality of the moment. It was supposed to be closure, but it never was. Each night after, Hale carried the memory like a stone in his chest. He had survived because she had chosen to break cover, and the guilt of that exchange never lessened. Now, 8 years on, the scar on her face and the calm in her eyes brought the entire valley back. The record had erased her, but his memory never had. The guilt lived sharp and permanent, proof that some truths outlasted even the stone they carved her name into. The hangar was dim by late afternoon. Shafts of sunlight cutting through dust and oil haze to stretch long shadows across the floor. Richard Hale stood just inside the doorway, his chest tight with the weight of words that had been building since the moment he saw her face. Alexandra Ward was bent over a fuel line, tightening a connection with her usual calm precision. The sight of her working as though she had never been gone twisted something inside him. He could no longer keep silent. He stepped closer, his boots echoing sharply on the concrete. She straightened, but did not flinch. Only wiped her hands on a rag with the same steady motion, as if he had not been watching her. Hale's voice came rough, nearly breaking from restraint. Why disappear? Why let us bury an empty box? She met his eyes, pale and unblinking. The faint scar along her jaw caught the dying light. She spoke evenly, without apology, because staying would have put others in danger. Her words struck him like a cold wind. He tried to speak again, but the room seemed heavier, filled with the muted hum of rotor blades idling outside. The hangar swallowed the sound, making it feel like memory, bleeding back through time. He remembered Naruk Valley, the way her voice had carried them through chaos, and the static that marked her end. The air now felt the same, charged, brittle, as if the truth was pressing against the walls. Hale took another step, his urgency rising. You don't understand what that did to us. To me, I carried the weight of your death every day. If you were alive, you should have come back. Her expression didn't falter. She folded the rag in her hands as though the act itself could erase the tension between them. I couldn't. Not without undoing what had to be done. Naruk Valley wasn't the end. The words hung between them like a blade. She had admitted it without detail, confirming what he had begun to fear. Whatever had happened in that valley, whatever she had been pulled into after, it was larger than the record, larger than the command that had written her name in stone. She had walked into the shadows of another mission, one still alive beneath the surface of the present. Hale's voice cracked, despite his attempt to steady it. What mission? Who are you working for? Her eyes flickered, then settled on him with an intensity that silenced him. She shook her head once. The answers won't help you. They'll only put more names on stones. The sound of her refusal cut deeper than any admission could. He felt desperation boiling, the need to tear away her silence and force the truth into the open. His hand tightened into a fist at his side. But she stood calm, shoulders squared, as if the decision had long been made. The rag in her hand, smudged with oil and dust, hung like a symbol of her life, lived between shadows. She used it to hide the traces of work, just as she used silence to hide the fragments of her past. For every question, Hale pressed. She answered with nothing more than composure. The air grew heavier. Shadows deepened, and for a moment it seemed the confrontation would shatter the fragile balance holding them. Hale's chest heaved with the weight of questions. But before he could demand more, the bass erupted. An alarm blared, sharp and unrelenting, vibrating through steel beams and echoing across the hangar like the static of old comms. Alexandra's head snapped toward the open doors. Without hesitation, she dropped the rag, grabbed her gloves, and moved toward the light spilling in. Hale called after her, his voice breaking with frustration and fear. She turned just enough for her gray eyes to catch his one last time. The mission isn't finished, she said. And then she was gone, her boots pounding across the concrete, swallowed by the roar of engines and the storm of scrambling crews. Hale stood rooted in the shadows, the alarm's echo merging with memory, until he could no longer tell which sound belonged to the present and which to the Valley of Ghosts. The alarm split the base wide open. Sirens screamed over the tarmac. The steady hum of daily rhythm shattered into chaos. Mechanics abandoned their toolboxes and shouted over the roar. Pilots sprinted across the concrete. Helmets clutched tight. Boots pounding against dust that already lifted in swirls from spinning rotors. The air tasted of grit and jet fuel, heavy enough to coat every breath. Helicopters lined the flight line. Engines spooling up in waves. Each thunder of blades adding to the storm. Alexandra Ward moved through the frenzy with a strange calm. While others shouted and stumbled, she walked straight toward the far end, where a Blackhawk sat ready. The crew scrambled around it. One pilot leaning from the cockpit window, with confusion spreading across his face as she pulled herself into the gunner's seat. Her movements were practiced. Precise. The straps of the harness snapped into place with no hesitation. She adjusted the swivel mount with the familiarity of someone who had done it countless times before. Her scar catching the flash of warning lights as dust whipped across her profile. Richard Hale pushed through the flood of bodies, his heart hammering as he spotted her strapping in. The pilot's voice cut through the din, shouting to him above the roar of engines. "Sir, who is she?" Hale's throat burned, but his answer came like an order already decided. "Let her go." The pilot froze only a second, then nodded, trusting authority over confusion. Hale stood rooted as the Blackhawk lifted, rotors slashing the air, dust exploding in a halo around it. The storm swallowed her figure until only the thunder of blades remained. For a heartbeat, Hale could almost believe he was back in the valley years ago. The sound of liftoff, carrying ghosts into fire. The convoy pinned in Naruk Valley had sent the call. The pattern was too familiar. The terrain, a cruel mirror of the past. Enemy fire rained from the ridges. Bullets chewing into dirt roads and armored panels. Smoke trails wound upward from detonated vehicles. Soldiers pressed into shallow ditches, waiting for help that seemed too late. The Blackhawk swept in, low. Dust and tracer fire tangled in the air as Alexandra leaned into the mounted weapon, eyes steady through the sight. Her voice came across the comms, low and calm, sliding through static like a blade. "Hold fire until you see the white scarf." Hale froze when he heard it. The exact cadence, the same surgical tone that had guided them before. On the ground, the pinned soldiers obeyed. Watching smoke and shapes through the valley haze, a figure appeared on the ridge, head wrapped in a pale scarf, leading the enemy squad down. At her command, the convoy held until they were in full view. Then the Blackhawk opened fire. Alexandra's bursts precise, cutting the advance apart before it could close. Her voice followed again, steady, directing units to shift left, to dig in, to wait for the second burst before moving. Each word pulled the scattered men into rhythm. Through Hale's headset at the command post, it was as if time folded, past and present, bleeding into one. 8 years vanished. Alexandra Ward was guiding them once more. Unseen, but unmistakable. On the ground, the fight surged. Smoke rolled thick. Rounds cracked against steel and rock. The pinned soldiers followed her timing, slipping out of dead zones into shallow cover, exactly when her voice told them. Every move carried the same certainty she had given before. Each command a lifeline across chaos. From the gunner's seat, she was a figure of stillness wrapped in violence. Her harness bound her back to war. The headset clamped over her ears, carrying her voice to every man in the valley. To them, she was no refueler, no nameless mechanic. She was the anchor that cut through panic. The same ghost who had once disappeared in fire. At the command post, Hale leaned forward, palms pressed against the desk, listening with his chest tight. Each word she spoke was both salvation and a reminder of what had been lost. He had thought her buried under stone and ceremony, but the battlefield had pulled her back. He could not deny it now. The mission she spoke of had never ended. It was still alive. And she with it. When the Black Hawk finally banked out of the valley, soldiers lifted from the ditches, alive and moving. The pinned convoy was breathing again. Hale closed his eyes as her final call echoed in his headset. Calm and unhurried. A voice reborn from dust and static. The rotor blades thundered overhead as the helicopter carried them all back. Repeating history. Carrying ghosts. The sun was beginning to sink when the Black Hawk came back over the ridge. Its rotors churned the air into a rolling storm. The battered bird dipping slightly to one side as though even the sky itself felt the weight of what it carried. Dust rose in a thick cloud as it descended, blurring the outline of the fuselage until the landing skids struck hard against the tarmac. The machine groaned, engines whining in protest. But it held. Relief rippled across the crews rushing forward. A wave of shouts and pounding boots breaking against the fading roar. Medics were the first to reach the open doors. They pulled stretchers from their rigs and climbed aboard, emerging moments later with wounded soldiers strapped down tight. Faces pale. Uniforms shredded. Eyes glassy but alive. The medics shouted vital signs, called for fluids, and hurried across the flight line toward waiting ambulances. Every man lifted from that bird was another piece of proof that the scramble had not been for nothing. Through the haze, Alexandra Ward stepped down. She moved with the same steady calm as she had in the hangar. But her presence struck different now. Dust smeared her cheek. Her sleeve was torn by a fresh grazing round, and the faint scar along her jaw glowed pale under the setting light. She looked like she had walked out of a memory that was never supposed to breathe again. Her boots crunched on the gravel, as if nothing around her could shake her balance. Richard Hale was there waiting. His chest was still tight from the hour of listening. His ears still ringing, with the echo of her voice across comms. He stared at her as she came closer. His own shadow stretched long in the amber dust. When she was near enough, the words spilled from him raw. "You didn't have to go." She paused just long enough to meet his eyes. Gray and unreadable. Her answer came low but certain. "Yes, I did." The mission wasn't finished. The bluntness of it nearly staggered him. For years he had carried her death like a stone. Every decision after weighed against it. Now she stood here telling him that her return was not about survival, not about proving a ghost could still breathe, but about something deeper. He tried to press her, to understand, but she spoke again before he could find the words. "The people we lose aren't gone if what they fought for survives." She looked past him, to the medics lifting the last stretcher into the ambulance, to the rotor wash carrying dust into the orange sky. That's the only way to honor them. You keep going. You finish what they couldn't. The simplicity of her words struck with more force than any explanation of her years in hiding. For the first time in nearly a decade, Hale felt something loosen inside his chest. The guilt he had nursed since the valley shifted, no longer an iron weight, but a burden that could be carried forward with meaning. He realized then that her silence, her disappearance, had not been abandonment. It had been continuation. Around them the chaos ebbed. The engines wound down into weary silence, the dust cloud thinning until the base stood clear again. Mechanics moved in to secure the helicopter, their voices dropping to murmurs, as if they too felt the heaviness of the moment. The sky above burned orange, deepening into purple at the horizon, a sunset that looked like both an ending and a warning that darkness was near. Alexandra brushed dust from her sleeve where the tear exposed a faint line of skin. She did it with no sign of pride or concern, as if the wound meant nothing compared to the lives carried off on stretchers. The symbolism of it struck Hale. The torn sleeve was the mark of survival at cost, a reminder that the fight demanded something, even when victory looked clean. He took a step closer, wanting to ask what came next. If she would stay. If the mission she spoke of was finally finished. But the words caught in his throat. Something in her expression told him she already had her answer, one that belonged to her alone. She looked at him once more, not as a commander, not as a man who had buried her name in stone, but as someone who could finally see. The last ambulance doors slammed shut. Sirens wailed faintly as they pulled away toward the medical wing. For a long moment, silence draped itself across the base, broken only by the wind-shifting dust along the flight line. Hale breathed deep, letting the air fill him with something almost like release. True honor, he realized, was not in medals or memorials. It was in the weight carried forward, in unfinished burdens taken up by those who remained. Alexandra had lived it in silence. And now, watching her step back into the shadows with the sun bleeding behind her, he understood. Some ghosts do not return for recognition. They return to make sure the fight does not die. Dusk settled across the base, the desert bleeding into colors that seemed pulled from fire and ash. The ridges glowed with the last light of day, and the flight line, once alive with chaos, now stood in heavy stillness. Alexandra Ward walked along the gravel path toward the far horizon, her boots crunching quietly with each step. The dust clung to her uniform, her torn sleeve brushing against her thigh with every movement. Her silhouette grew smaller as the distance swallowed her. She did not hurry. She never had. Each step looked deliberate, as if she had already chosen where she was going, though no one else would ever know. Richard Hale stood a few paces behind her, unwilling to let the moment close. The weight of everything they had lived through pressed down on him again. He found his voice, raw and unsteady in the falling light. "Will I ever see you again?" She stopped just long enough to glance back, her pale gray eyes catching the final blaze of the sun. Her answer came soft, carried on the evening wind. "Maybe. If the mission calls for it." Then she turned away once more, her figure shrinking against the vast desert horizon until she was little more than a shadow walking into the fading light. Hale did not move until the sun had fully dipped and the line of her body vanished. Only then did he feel how empty the space around him had become. He walked back through the base in silence, the voices of crews fading into background noise, his thoughts occupied by the echo of her words and the sound of her voice over comms that still haunted him from years ago. Later, in his office, the desk lamp cast its familiar circle of yellow across the scattered folders. He reached for one drawer with deliberate care. From it he pulled the file, stamped in heavy black ink, "Deceased, Alexandra Ward." The paper edges were worn. The ink faded slightly from years of being untouched. He opened it and stared at the record that told a story he knew now was false. His hand hovered over the pages, memories of folded flags and memorial walls rushing back. He saw the day her name was read aloud, the silence of soldiers standing in formation, the flag folded with reverence and handed to a grieving man who believed he was her brother. He saw the empty weight of it all, the finality that had been given to her when no body was ever found. Closing the file, he slipped it back into the drawer, turning the key to lock it. The sound of the mechanism snapping shut carried a strange relief. Some truths, he realized, were better held in silence. Her survival was not meant for records. It was meant for those who had heard her voice when everything seemed lost. Hale leaned back in his chair, staring at the wall. He thought of all the ceremonies he had attended, the folded flags lined up in neat rows, the memorial names carved in stone. He thought of how honor had always been presented as something public, a recognition of sacrifice through ritual. Yet Alexandra had shown him another kind. Her honor was lived in silence, unseen, never recorded. Her service was a whisper, not a declaration, and yet it carried more weight than medals pinned on a chest. Her words echoed again, the memory of her voice calm and steady, even when surrounded by chaos. He remembered her saying to hold fire until the white scarf, remembered the unflinching tone that cut through static. That voice was now part of him, lodged deeper than any official briefing. He knew it would remain, surfacing in quiet moments, guiding him even when she was gone. Weeks later, the story began to spread among crews. It was never official, never written into logs, but whispered across barracks and mess halls, Some said a nameless gunner had guided them out of the valley. Others claimed an old ghost had stepped out of the shadows to fly one more mission. No one spoke her name. They didn't have to. The silence around it was louder than anything written down. Hale never confirmed it. Never denied it. He listened sometimes when the younger mechanics traded half-truths in low voices. They would never know the full story. They weren't meant to. The ghost among them would remain just that, unrecorded, unacknowledged, but unforgettable. On evenings when the base settled into quiet, Hale found himself standing alone on the tarmac. He would look toward the horizon where she had disappeared. The setting sun bleeding orange into purple. The desert swallowed her once, and he knew it might again. Yet he no longer felt the crushing guilt that had lived in him for 8 years. Now he carried something else. Something steadier. The insight came to him not as revelation but as understanding slowly built. The greatest service was not always in survival or in remembrance. It was in carrying forward the unfinished burdens of the fallen, ensuring their fight endured unseen. Alexandra Ward had chosen that path. Her legacy was not in her name carved in stone, but in the living who survived because of her. In the echoes of her voice carried through static and silence, Hale closed his eyes and listened. Even in the quiet of his office, he could almost hear her again, low and unhurried, guiding him through the chaos. He breathed deep and let it anchor him, a voice reborn in memory, carrying him forward into the silence that followed.